February 1945, Iwo Jima. The volcanic island trembles under endless bombardment. Smoke rises in black pillars, twisting into a sky the color of ash. The sand burns underfoot, sharp, metallic, alive with shrapnel. Inside a cramped Marine command tent, a single bulb swings from its wire, flickering over sweating faces and radio sets. Two Marines lean close to a microphone. Their voices move fast, almost melodic, not in English, not in code, but in Navajo. Outside, in the ruins of an enemy outpost, a Japanese intelligence officer listens to an intercepted transmission. He writes the strange syllables down. Again and again he frowns, comparing them to every cipher he knows. Nothing matches. Not Morse, not numeric substitution, not phonetic encryption. He slams the notebook shut. The words make no sense. No pattern, no key. And yet, within minutes, American artillery adjusts fire precisely onto hidden Japanese positions. The officer stares at the explosions, realizing the truth that will haunt Japan's codebreakers for the rest of the war. The Americans were speaking in a language no enemy could ever break. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, communication became the lifeline of every battle. Orders, coordinates, and reinforcements moved not by messenger or flag, but through invisible signals riding the air. In this new kind of warfare, whoever controlled the airwaves controlled victory itself. The Japanese military knew this well. Their intelligence units, especially the emphatic and Unit 7313, had earned a grim reputation for code-breaking and interception. Early in the war, Japanese cryptologists successfully deciphered U.S. Army and Navy codes, exploiting weaknesses in standard encryption methods like Type B ciphers and basic substitution systems. Each time an American transmission was intercepted and read, entire units walked into ambushes without ever knowing how the enemy had anticipated them. By 1942, the United States faced a crisis in military communication. Even as the Navy developed complex machines like the ECM Mark II, the SI GABA, frontline coordination among Marine units in the Pacific remained painfully vulnerable. In the jungles of Guadalcanal and in the coral atolls of the Solomons, secure communication was often impossible. Japanese units could triangulate and jam open channels, forcing Marines to rely on runners or delayed relays, costing lives and momentum. The Marine Corps needed a solution, fast, secure, and simple enough to use in combat. Something no enemy linguist could unravel. That solution would come from an unexpected source. A man who wasn't a cryptographer or a soldier, but a civilian engineer and missionary son named Philip Johnston. Johnston had grown up on the Navajo reservation in Arizona, the child of Presbyterian missionaries. He spoke fluent Navajo, one of the most complex indigenous languages on Earth, and he understood something few military officers did: its potential for secrecy. In early 1942, Johnston approached the Marine Corps in Los Angeles with a bold idea. He proposed using Native American languages, specifically Navajo, as a basis for a spoken battlefield code. His reasoning was simple but revolutionary. Navajo had no written form, was unrelated to any other language, and was virtually unknown outside the tribe. Even within the United States, fewer than 30 non-Navajos could speak it fluently. The Marines were skeptical. The idea of using an unwritten language as military encryption sounded naive, even primitive. Intelligence officers believed Japan's linguists could simply learn the language or use captured interpreters. But Johnston persisted. He argued that even if the Japanese obtained a Navajo speaker, the planned system would combine linguistic structure with cryptographic mapping, making it incomprehensible without context. Finally, the Marine Corps agreed to a small demonstration at Camp Elliott, California, in February 1942. Johnston brought 4 Navajo volunteers. They were given random English messages to transmit and decode across the base using improvised radios. Officers watched in silence as the men began speaking. Within minutes, the messages arrived flawlessly at the other end, faster and more accurate than any encoded English transmission. When the decoded message read, "Enemy heading northeast, ready to strike," the commanding officer turned to Johnston, stunned. No cipher charts, no mechanical devices, just pure language, secure, rapid, unbreakable. Within weeks, the Marine Corps approved the creation of a pilot program, the recruitment of the first 29 Navajo Code Talkers. These men were trained not only as Marines but as architects of an entirely new form of code, one built from culture, sound, and memory. By spring of 1942, they gathered at Camp Pendleton. The task before them was immense. They needed to construct a military vocabulary for a language that had never described tanks, airplanes, or bombs. They began with analogies rooted in Navajo tradition. Turtle for tank, ironfish for submarine, hummingbird for fighter aircraft. Their code would eventually grow to include more than 400 words, each representing letters, terms, and tactical concepts, all woven into natural Navajo syntax. Every word was memorized, not written. No dictionary, no codebook, no paper trail. Back in Washington, most military analysts dismissed the idea as a novelty, a minor experiment in wartime improvisation. They didn't yet realize that this novelty would soon become the most secure and indispensable communication system in the Pacific Theater. And while American officers began to see its promise on the other side of the ocean, Japanese intelligence continued their steady success at intercepting U.S. communications. They had broken Army Air Corps cipher codes, and their linguists had translated captured signal manuals. They believed the Americans were running out of secrets to hide. They had no idea that somewhere in California, 29 young Navajo men were about to give America one of the greatest secrets of the war. A code not written by machines, but spoken by the Earth's oldest voice. By the summer of 1942, the experiment had become a mission. The 29 original Navajo Code Talkers were now full-fledged Marines, trained riflemen, communicators, and cryptographic pioneers. Their mission: build, test, and perfect a living code that could withstand the chaos of combat. At Camp Pendleton, the men worked under strict secrecy. They weren't allowed to discuss their work with other units, not even with fellow Navajos outside the program. They created a system that paired Navajo words with English letters, developing a double-layered structure. One alphabetic, the other conceptual. For example, the English letter A could be represented by several Navajo words: Wolachi, ant; Belasana, apple; or senile, axe. This redundancy prevented frequency analysis, the very technique code breakers relied upon to crack messages. The men tested the system relentlessly. Messages were sent across long distances, then retranslated to check for consistency. What emerged wasn't merely a code, it was a linguistic fortress. Every sentence moved like poetry, yet carried the precision of a military command. By August 1942, the first group of code talkers was deployed with the 1st Marine Division to the Battle of Guadalcanal. It was a brutal, untested theater, dense jungles, swarming mosquitoes, and constant threat from both air and sea. The Navajo Marines carried their radios on their backs, hiking through mud and darkness, setting up makeshift transmission posts near the front lines. When the fighting began, their value became immediately clear. Japanese signal intelligence units, who had been intercepting and deciphering American transmissions for months, suddenly encountered messages that defied all pattern recognition. They captured fragments of transmissions that read like tonal chants or rhythmic bursts of sound. Analysts assumed it was a form of coded English or a new encryption system, but after multiple attempts and linguistic cross-checks, their reports reached a dead end. No cipher wheel, no translation, no progress. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Navajo Code Talkers were changing how the Marines fought. Their messages, often 3 lines long, could be transmitted, received, and decoded in under 20 seconds. Conventional ciphers took hours. On chaotic battlefields where seconds decided life or death, this difference was revolutionary. As one Marine officer later wrote, "Our success depended on the speed and accuracy of those voices. They were faster than any machine we had." In the months that followed, the Navajo system spread rapidly. More code talkers were recruited and trained, expanding the vocabulary, refining procedures, and ensuring standardization across Marine divisions. By 1943, more than 200 Navajos were operating in active combat zones across the Pacific, from Bougainville to Tarawa. Each success strengthened the reputation of the Code Talkers. Messages once vulnerable to interception now vanished into an ocean of sound only a handful of men could understand. And yet, even as American commanders celebrated their newfound security, Japanese officers refused to believe such a thing could exist. Reports from intercepted transmissions began to alarm them. Japanese analysts identified repeated phonetic sounds, But every attempt to assign meaning failed. Even captured recordings yielded nothing. Linguists from universities in Tokyo and Osaka were summoned, but none recognized the language. It was not Chinese, not Korean, not any Pacific dialect. In late 1943, Japanese intelligence finally concluded that these transmissions were an advanced form of cryptography, possibly using a hybrid artificial language. They were half right. By the time of the Bougainville campaign, the Navajo Code had become the most secure battlefield system ever employed by U.S. forces. Orders could travel from command ships to frontline squads in minutes, coordinates, troop movements, artillery requests, all spoken in words born of ancient oral tradition. But the code talkers themselves remained invisible. To most Marines, they were just radio operators. Few knew the scope of what they were doing, or the fact that Japanese intelligence had placed enormous priority on trying to break their transmissions. In Tokyo, intercepted recordings were played in secret meetings among senior intelligence officers. One analyst even suggested capturing one of the strange-voiced Americans alive to extract information. But in the Pacific's chaos, no such operation ever succeeded. As 1944 approached, the war was turning. The United States was gaining ground, island by island, and communication had become its most powerful weapon. Behind each advance and every radio message relayed under fire, the Navajo voices carried silent precision across the airwaves. They had proven that language, and not technology, could achieve what cryptography never had: absolute secrecy, born of culture and memory. But the true test of this code, and the moment it would become legendary, was still to come. Because in the battles that followed, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, the Japanese would realize just how deeply they had underestimated those voices from the desert. They were young, most barely in their early 20s. Farmers, shepherds, and students from the mesas of Arizona and New Mexico. Many had never left their reservations before the war. Their names were Chester Nez, Peter McDonald, Joe Hosteen Kelwood, and dozens more. Ordinary men who carried an extraordinary gift. When they enlisted, they entered a world that barely understood them. At boot camp, drill instructors struggled with their names. Other Marines sometimes mocked their accents, unaware that these same men would soon carry the lifeline of the Pacific War on their tongues. The code talkers didn't complain. They trained harder, spoke little, and learned fast. They knew discipline was survival, both as Marines and as Navajo men representing a people whose language had once been banned in American schools. Now that same language was their weapon. At night, in the dim glow of barracks lamps, they would practice messages with quiet concentration, whispering into their handsets, repeating words until they were sharp and flawless. There was no room for error. A single mistranslated word could send artillery onto friendly troops or delay reinforcements. They carried their radios through jungle mud, across coral reefs, and into volcanic ash, always at the center of the storm, yet rarely noticed. For them, secrecy wasn't just protocol. It was duty. One code talker later said, "We couldn't tell anyone what we were doing. We just knew it was important, maybe the most important thing we'd ever do." These men didn't ask for recognition. They asked only for precision, to speak clearly, to relay orders quickly, to save lives. Their courage wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, unshakable. In every battle, amid chaos and death, they brought something no machine could reproduce: human memory fused with cultural pride. Before the code talkers, American radio communication in the Pacific was a nightmare. Messages were often encoded using standard military ciphers that required written reference tables, slow, cumbersome, and prone to error under fire. During early campaigns like Guadalcanal, delays of even a few minutes cost lives. The Navajo system changed that overnight. Its speed was unmatched. What once took half an hour could be done in seconds. A 3-line message in English could be spoken, transmitted, and decoded in less than 20 seconds. No device, no paper, no key, only voice. Commanders soon realized that with code talkers, they could coordinate artillery, airstrikes, and troop movements with near-instant accuracy. During the Battle of Saipan, reports show Navajo teams relaying over 800 messages in 2 days without a single error. Major Howard Connor of the 5th Marine Division later said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." Their radios, the SCR 300 walkie-talkie and TBX field set, became extensions of their bodies. They carried them up ridges, through tunnels, and into frontline trenches, often transmitting under direct enemy fire. In the confusion of battle, their calm, rhythmic Navajo transmissions cut through static and gunfire like a song of order amid chaos. Each code talker operated in teams. One transmitted, another received. Messages were relayed across units, from frontline platoons to command ships miles offshore. Because the code relied entirely on human memory, there was nothing for the enemy to capture. No written documents, no cipher machines. Tactically, the impact was immense. Japanese commanders could no longer anticipate U.S. maneuvers or ambush points. Artillery barrages fell precisely where they were needed. Amphibious assaults moved with synchronized precision unseen in earlier campaigns. The Navajo Code wasn't just a language. It was a network, one that bound entire divisions together with unbreakable trust in the voices carrying their fate. In Tokyo, frustration grew. By 1943, Japanese intelligence officers were intercepting more American traffic than ever before. Yet large portions of it made no sense. They called it the singing code. Teams of linguists were assembled to study recordings from intercepted field transmissions. They mapped syllables, tonal shifts, and repeated sequences. But the data led nowhere. Every pattern they discovered dissolved as soon as it was tested against another message. At first, analysts assumed it was a machine-generated encryption system, possibly a speech synthesizer. But field reports contradicted that theory. Radio operators clearly identified human voices. Each message sounded like natural conversation, yet carried military meaning. Some intelligence officers speculated it might be a Pacific Island dialect. Others suggested it was a deliberate distortion of English. But none could identify a single linguistic root. Captured Marines were interrogated, yet none could explain it, because none outside the code talkers understood it. Even when Japanese soldiers captured radio equipment and transcripts, they gained nothing. No codebooks existed. No translations were written. By late 1944, a classified Japanese intelligence memo concluded, "The enemy employs a language we cannot identify. It is likely not of European or Asian origin." That single sentence marked the first and only formal acknowledgement of the Navajo Code's existence by Japan's wartime intelligence. They would never come closer to breaking it. The enemy, once proud of their code-breaking prowess, now faced a mystery that no cryptanalyst could touch. A spoken code, protected not by machines or mathematics, but by heritage and memory. The code had now proven itself in combat, and its defenders, both the Marines and their Navajo comrades, trusted it completely. But the true test of this unbreakable language would come in 1945, on a small island of black sand where every inch of ground would be paid for in blood. That island was Iwo Jima, and it was there that the Navajo Code Talkers would show the world what their voices were truly capable of. By mid-war, cryptography was becoming a race of machines. Both Axis and Allied powers invested heavily in cipher devices. Japan with its Type B machine, Germany with the Enigma, and the U.S. with Sagaba. These devices used mechanical rotors, electrical wiring, and mathematical permutations to generate complex codes. But on the battlefield, technology had limits. Machines required maintenance, power, and time. Messages had to be typed, encoded, transmitted, received, decoded. A process that could take several minutes, sometimes hours. And one broken wire or jammed key could halt an entire operation. The Navajo Code changed that paradigm entirely. It was a biological cipher, powered not by circuitry but by cognition. Each code talker carried the entire encryption system in his memory, able to generate or interpret messages instantly. It needed no electricity, no repair, and could adapt on the spot. Its strength wasn't in mathematical randomness, but in linguistic obscurity. The Navajo language was tonal, complex, and structurally alien to Indo-European tongues. It had no written alphabet, no universal translation pattern, and was almost impossible to learn without immersion. Even advanced linguists faced with its syntax and phonetics found it impenetrable. In practical terms, this meant that no mechanical decryption method could even begin to analyze the code. There were no frequency patterns to exploit, no letter repetitions to track. Each message sounded organic, different each time yet precise in meaning. Where machines could be stolen or reverse engineered, the Navajo Code existed only in the human mind. It was the perfect fusion of technology's goal and humanity's adaptability, faster than any cipher, safer than any lock. In a war defined by steel, fire, and machinery, victory came through the one thing no enemy could reproduce: a living language. Behind every great wartime innovation stands someone who believed in it when others did not. For the Navajo Code Talkers, that figure was Major General Clayton B. Vogel, commanding general of the 2nd Marine Division. When Philip Johnston proposed the use of Navajo in early 1942, Vogel saw what others missed. He understood that in a world obsessed with technology, the most unorthodox solution might be the most secure. He pushed the concept through Marine channels, personally endorsing the recruitment of the 1st Navajo Group. Once deployed, the Code Talkers quickly earned respect from their commanding officers. Men like Major Howard Connor and Lieutenant Colonel James Jones, who witnessed their speed and accuracy firsthand. Connor famously commanded 6 Navajo operators during the Battle of Iwo Jima. They worked around the clock, sending and receiving over 800 messages in 48 hours, each without a single error. Leadership also meant protection. Senior Marine officers went to great lengths to keep the Code Talkers' mission secret, even from other U.S. branches. If the code's structure leaked, it could lose its value. So the men were ordered never to write down the code, never to discuss it, and never to share details, even after the war ended. This secrecy extended to their identity. In the eyes of official military records, they were simply radio operators. Their names appeared nowhere in public reports. Even when generals praised flawless communication systems, few outside the Corps knew who was responsible. And yet within Marine ranks, respect was absolute. Officers learned quickly that if you wanted your messages to reach command fast and clean, you found a Navajo operator. They were trusted implicitly, the invisible thread that tied command to chaos, order to survival. These leaders recognized that innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or factories. Sometimes it comes from a people whose voices had been silenced, now speaking for an army that had once ignored them. Perhaps the most profound layer of this story isn't found in tactics or linguistics, but in irony. Only decades earlier, Navajo children were punished in government boarding schools for speaking their language. They were told to abandon their heritage, to speak English, to forget the words of their ancestors. By 1942, those same words had become a national weapon. For many Code Talkers, that irony wasn't lost. They had grown up in a country that treated their culture as obsolete. Yet now that culture was saving American lives across the Pacific. When they joined the Marines, they took an oath not just to defend the United States, but to preserve something far older: the spirit of their people, encoded in every sound they spoke. They were warriors in 2 battles, one for victory abroad, another for dignity at home. The war gave them purpose, but it didn't erase the contradictions. In the segregated military of the 1940s, Navajo Marines were often treated as outsiders, yet their contribution was indispensable, and without them, entire operations would have faltered. That quiet moral paradox runs like a current through the story of the Code Talkers. They used the language America tried to erase, to protect the nation that once erased it. They spoke softly, but every syllable carried centuries of endurance. When a Marine officer once asked a Code Talker what their secret was, he replied simply, "Our secret is that we remember." By 1945, the Code had grown into a force of its own, a hidden weapon moving beneath the noise of the Pacific War. It was faster than technology, stronger than encryption, and purer than any intelligence algorithm. But soon it would face the ultimate trial, a battle where communication, timing, and survival would decide everything. That battle was Iwo Jima, the turning point of both the Pacific Campaign and the legend of the Navajo Code. February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima. The sky over the island was thick with smoke and sound. From the decks of hundreds of ships, the U.S. Navy unleashed the most massive pre-invasion bombardment of the Pacific War. The black volcanic island, barely 8 square miles, was a fortress of tunnels, bunkers and artillery pits carved by 21,000 Japanese defenders under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. The Marines who landed that morning had one objective: capture Iwo Jima and its airfields, vital stepping stones for the bombing of Japan. But as soon as the first waves reached the beach, reality struck. The island wasn't silent after the bombardment. It was waiting. Japanese guns opened up from hidden positions. turning the landing zone into a killing ground. Every radio operator became a prime target. Communication was the heart of the invasion, and if that chain broke, entire units would be cut off. Among those operators were Navajo Code Talkers from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions. They carried their heavy SCR-300 radios through ash that sank like powder beneath their boots. Their mission: maintain the only secure line of communication between the beaches and command posts. Within minutes of landing, the chaos was absolute. Units were scattered, maps became useless, and smoke blinded direction. Yet the voices of the Code Talkers remained steady, flowing through static and gunfire like the pulse of the battle itself. Each phrase carried coordinates, updates, or artillery calls. They spoke in perfect rhythm, switching from English thought to Navajo form without hesitation. Their radios crackled with life while others fell silent, jammed, cut, or destroyed. Major Howard Connor, 5th Marine Division's signal officer, operated 6 Navajo Code Talkers from his command post. For 48 continuous hours, they transmitted nearly 800 messages, none with a single error. These included requests for ammunition, casualty reports, and crucial fire missions that redirected entire battalions. At one point, a U.S. destroyer offshore reported Japanese movements near Mount Suribachi. Within minutes, a Code Talker transmitted new coordinates to Marine artillery. A barrage followed, pinning down the defenders just long enough for the 28th Regiment to begin its historic climb. Hours later, the flag rose over Suribachi, a moment immortalized in one photograph and made possible by voices no camera ever recorded. For the Marines on the ground, the Navajo transmissions became lifelines, clear, instant, and unbreakable. When Japanese forces tried to jam American frequencies, the Code Talkers shifted bands effortlessly, maintaining fluid communication between ships, command posts, and frontline squads. Enemy intelligence teams hidden in tunnels and caves intercepted those signals and listened helplessly. They recognized the same strange syllables they'd heard before, that melodic rhythmic sound that haunted their analysts. Reports were sent back to Tokyo. Unidentified language transmission continues. Cannot decipher. Inside the Japanese command bunker, frustration mounted. Kuribayashi's intelligence officers demanded analysis, patterns, meanings, any clue. But nothing fit. The intercepted words changed constantly. There were no repeating phrases, no keys to decode. What they didn't realize was that even if they captured a Navajo Code Talker alive, they would still be lost. The code wasn't written anywhere. It lived entirely in memory, layered within an ancient language shaped long before radio ever existed. On Iwo Jima, that language carried the weight of thousands of lives. It relayed calls for reinforcements, corrected artillery, guided medics through smoke and gunfire, and coordinated tank advances through terrain so unstable that even bulldozers sank into ash. One Marine officer later recalled, "We would have been cut off without them. Every order, every movement, it came through those voices." The Japanese counterattacks were relentless. At night, they crept through tunnels and launched banzai charges, trying to overwhelm the beachhead. The Code Talkers transmitted by the dim light of covered lamps, whispering into handsets while explosions thundered overhead. If they were discovered, they were to destroy their radios. The code could not be captured alive. Day after day as the battle raged, their transmissions never faltered. When a radio line went dead, another Code Talker would appear from the smoke, set up his set, and pick up the thread mid-sentence. Their accuracy and endurance astonished even hardened veterans. By the time the Marines declared Iwo Jima secure on March 26, 1945, more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, and nearly 7,000 Americans had fallen. Yet through it all, not a single message sent in Navajo was ever misinterpreted or broken. As General Vogel wrote in his after-action report, the Navajo Code has proven to be the most successful and secure communication system in military history. The war was far from over, but after Iwo Jima, there was no longer any doubt. The code that Japan had dismissed as nonsense had become the very sound of American victory. But in the shadow of that victory, the Japanese intelligence community launched one last desperate effort: a full-scale analysis of every intercepted transmission from Iwo Jima. They were determined to find an answer, a flaw, a pattern, anything that could explain what they had heard. And what they discovered only deepened their disbelief. Tokyo, March 1945. In a dimly lit room within the Imperial Army's Communications Intelligence Bureau, rows of officers sat before long tables stacked with intercepted American radio transcripts. Each page bore strange phonetic markings, Tuizi Atsa Che Digahi, handwritten by Japanese linguists who had spent months trying to identify the mysterious language. The atmosphere was suffocating. Japan's cities were burning under relentless American air raids. Tokyo itself had been devastated just days earlier. And now, intelligence officers were being ordered to explain why, after 3 years of war, they still couldn't break the Americans' new code. Their senior analyst, Colonel Hiroshi Izumi, stared at the transcripts through wire-rimmed glasses. Every previous American cipher, from the early Army Air Corps codes to the complex Navy JN series, had at least yielded fragments under pressure. But this was different. The syllables didn't match any linguistic root known to them. They weren't Chinese, Korean, or any known dialect from the Pacific. Some officers even speculated the Americans had invented a code language, a kind of constructed speech. But the phonetic repetition was too natural, the rhythm too fluid. It sounded human, ancient. Izumi ordered his team to break it down phonetically, letter by letter. They compared waveforms, counted frequencies, mapped recurring sounds, and all in vain. Each message seemed unique. Even identical reports never repeated the same pattern twice. They didn't realize that each Navajo Code Talker was translating English concepts into words symbolized by animals, elements, and sacred objects. A code within a language. A bomber was a J-show buzzard. A submarine was Beshlo ironfish. Even letters of the alphabet were replaced by entire Navajo words. A for Wulachi, ant, B for shush, bear, and so on. What Japan's cryptanalysts were hearing wasn't encryption. It was culture itself weaponized. As their frustration mounted, reports from the front worsened. At Okinawa, the same mysterious transmissions appeared again, directing naval gunfire and coordinating amphibious assaults with deadly precision. Japanese signals units on the island confirmed it. The same voice patterns, the same impossible-to-decode rhythm. The realization was devastating. The Americans hadn't just developed a new cipher. They had created a living code, carried in the minds of native speakers whose culture had survived centuries of suppression, now becoming a weapon of modern war. In April 1945, during the height of the Okinawa campaign, a Japanese linguist suggested that the voice might belong to Native Americans, recalling that some pre-war anthropologists had mentioned an obscure tribe in the U.S. Southwest with a complex tonal language. But when this idea reached senior command, it was dismissed as absurd. How could a tribe from Arizona possibly decide the fate of battles thousands of miles away? Meanwhile, in the mud and chaos of Okinawa, those very code talkers were doing exactly that. Under constant bombardment, they transmitted thousands of critical messages, from landing zone reports to airstrike coordination, with the same flawless precision they had shown on Iwo Jima. Major Connor's earlier assessment spread across Marine Corps leadership. Without the Navajo, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima as quickly as they did. At Okinawa, that statement proved prophetic. Japanese defensive positions were stronger, deeper, more entrenched than ever, but American command could now adapt instantly. Artillery fire redirected within minutes, tank columns rerouted before ambushes, supply drops shifted in real time. All of it carried by voices that Japan could hear but never understand. Intercepted messages piled up in Tokyo, forming a library of failure. The analysts began marking them with a new code of their own. Untranslatable, no linguistic correlation. By May, even the most experienced code breakers in the empire had quietly accepted defeat. Colonel Izumi's final report to the general staff was blunt. The language utilized by enemy forces cannot be classified as any known human language. It is not a cipher. It is a tongue unknown to science. That was the official record. A rare admission of absolute failure. For Japan's intelligence corps, it was the moment they realized that some walls could not be broken with logic or mathematics. And while Tokyo studied those intercepted sounds in laboratories, the U.S. military was already planning for the next stage, the invasion of Japan itself. The Code Talkers were slated to play a central role in Operation Downfall, expected to be the largest amphibious invasion in history. They would have been the invisible backbone of communication, ensuring that no message could be compromised as American forces prepared to land on Japanese soil. But history would take a different turn. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before that invasion began. The Navajo Code remained unbroken, not just through the war but for decades afterward. As surrender orders were transmitted in August 1945, intercepted by the same Japanese units who had spent years chasing the unbreakable language, one final irony lingered in the air. They could finally read the English of surrender, but never the Navajo that helped make it possible. The battle for communication was over, and the victory belonged to voices that had once been silenced, now echoing across the Pacific unstoppable. August 1945, the guns finally fell silent. Across the Pacific, from the ruins of Manila to the ash fields of Hiroshima, the sound of war dissolved into a heavy, almost unreal quiet. The Empire of Japan had surrendered. For the first time in years, the airwaves were no longer filled with encrypted voices, orders, and coordinates. But among those who had carried the weight of that invisible war, the Navajo Code Talkers, silence took on a different meaning. In the days after the surrender, the Marine divisions began to regroup across occupied islands. The surviving Code Talkers packed their radios, coiled their antenna wires, and waited for orders. Some expected to be called home as heroes. Instead, they received an instruction none had anticipated. The code remains classified. They were told never to speak of it. Not to family, not to friends, not even to other Marines. Their mission, they were reminded, was still secret. Even as the world celebrated victory, their triumph was buried beneath silence. For decades, the story of the Navajo Code remained hidden inside military archives. Reports were sealed. Records marked restricted. To the outside world, the Pacific War had been won through bombs, tanks, and firepower, not through the voices of men speaking an ancient tongue from the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico. Yet within the Marine Corps, those who had fought beside them never forgot. Officers like Major Howard Connor, who had witnessed their performance on Iwo Jima, repeatedly urged Washington to recognize their contribution. But the Cold War was beginning, and the U.S. military wanted to preserve the code, still flawless, still unbroken, in case it was ever needed again. Meanwhile, the Code Talkers returned home to a different kind of silence. Many went back to the Navajo Nation, to farms, sheep herding, and small towns far from the world they had saved. There were no parades waiting for them. Some carried scars, both visible and unseen, from battles where they had seen friends fall and death pass within feet of their radios. At the same time, the Japanese intelligence officers who had once obsessed over the Unbreakable Code faced their own reckoning. After the surrender, Allied occupation authorities questioned many of them about intercepted signals. None could explain it. Even under interrogation, they admitted the truth. It was not a code we could understand. We had no key. Their failure was not one of effort, but of imagination. They had tried to break something that was never meant to be decoded by outsiders. A living, breathing language formed by centuries of oral tradition. In the post-war years, the U.S. military quietly reviewed the performance of its wartime communication systems. Every code used by Allied forces had been compromised at some point, except one. The Navajo system was the only encryption method that never failed, never leaked, and never required modification. In a world transformed by cryptography, machines, and mathematics, it was a group of indigenous men, using words rooted in the earth, who had created perfection. But perfection has its own cost. Their work remained hidden, their names unknown, their service officially unacknowledged. In some cases, even their medals listed generic citations like meritorious service, with no mention of code work. They carried that silence for nearly 3 decades, and yet among their communities quiet pride endured. They knew what they had done, and what their words had meant. Every phrase they had spoken under fire had carried not just orders, but identity. Proof that their culture, once threatened by erasure, had become a shield for a nation that once tried to silence it. The irony was profound. The same language forbidden in American schools had saved American lives. As one veteran later recalled softly, "We were told never to speak Navajo. Then the Marines told us it could win a war." That silence, both imposed and chosen, would last until the U.S. military finally declassified the Navajo Code in the late 1960s. When the truth emerged, it would reshape how America remembered the Pacific War, and how it saw the men whose voices had carried victory across the airwaves. It would take more than 20 years for the secret to emerge. In 1968, the U.S. Department of Defense officially declassified the Navajo Code. For the first time, the public could read the reports, the vocabulary lists, and the glowing evaluations written by Marine Corps officers who had once guarded the secret like a weapon. The world was stunned. Historians who had studied every aspect of the Pacific War suddenly realized that one of its most decisive instruments of victory had never been mentioned in their books. The story spread through newspapers, schools, and television. The revelation that a code created by Native Americans, using no machinery or mathematics, had remained unbroken throughout the entire war. Interviews followed. Old men, now gray and soft-spoken, began to tell their stories for the first time. They spoke of landing on Iwo Jima, of speaking their childhood language through static and fear, of hearing gunfire so close it shook their radios. Many had never even told their families what they had done. Now they were finally free to speak. Recognition came slowly, but it came with reverence. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan signed a proclamation declaring August 14th as National Navajo Code Talkers Day, honoring their service and sacrifice. 10 years later, in 1992, the National Navajo Code Talkers Memorial was dedicated at Window Rock, Arizona, a circular sandstone monument engraved with the names of those who served. For the first time, their language was carved not into stone tablets or secret documents, but into the memory of a nation. Yet even in celebration, there was humility. Many code talkers simply said they were proud to have served. They didn't see themselves as heroes, only as Marines who did their duty. But for historians, linguists, and soldiers alike, the impact was deeper. The Navajo Code had redefined what language could be. It was not only a means of communication, but an instrument of survival. Proof that culture itself could become a strategic asset. The same oral traditions once dismissed as primitive had defeated the most advanced cryptographic minds of Imperial Japan. In 2001, nearly 60 years after Iwo Jima, President George W. Bush presented the Congressional Gold Medal to the original 29 Code Talkers who had developed the language in 1942. Silver medals were awarded to the hundreds who later joined their ranks. Only a handful lived to receive them. During that ceremony, the surviving veterans stood in uniform, their medals catching the sunlight. Some spoke quietly in Navajo, a language once forbidden, then weaponized, now celebrated. The audience listened in silence, aware that they were hearing the echo of something immortal. One of them, Chester Nez, the last of the original 29, later said, "Our language was born in the land, and it helped save this land." By the time of his death in 2014, the Navajo Code had become not just a military triumph, but a symbol of identity, the moment when ancient words carried the weight of modern war. Today, linguists still study the structure of the code. Cryptographers marvel that, even with modern computing, it remains functionally unbreakable without access to the original cultural context. It wasn't merely encryption, it was understanding, and that cannot be decoded by algorithms. Meanwhile, the last surviving code talkers continue to speak at schools, museums, and military academies, reminding new generations that victory isn't always written in steel and fire. Sometimes it's spoken softly, in a voice that refuses to die. And in the deserts of the Navajo Nation, where red rock meets open sky, elders still teach those same words, the living legacy of a code that once shaped the course of world history. Their story closes not with explosions or orders, but with quiet continuity, a language once silenced, now eternal. The dust of war has settled. The code has been revealed. Now only the deeper meaning remains, what it all says about communication, culture, and the resilience of human voices. War is remembered in explosions, in the thunder of guns, and the flash of victory. But the most decisive sounds of World War II were not explosions. They were words, whispered through radios, spoken in a tongue older than the nation it saved. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers is not only about communication, it is about identity reclaimed in the unlikeliest of places, the battlefield. At a time when their people were still forced into assimilation schools, where speaking their language was punished, those same words became America's most powerful secret weapon. It is one of history's great ironies. that a culture nearly silenced became the voice that turned the tide of war. When historians describe victory in the Pacific, they often speak of carriers, bombers, and the atomic bomb. Yet behind every advance, every coordinated strike, there was a voice speaking Navajo, invisible to the enemy, vital to the mission. Those voices carried more than orders. They carried trust. Between Marines under fire, between ships and shore, between fear and survival, for the Japanese cryptographers who tried and failed to decode it, the Navajo language was a mystery beyond logic. For the Marines who fought beside it, it was a lifeline. And for the Navajo people themselves, it became a form of redemption, a reminder that words can endure when even nations fall. Today, the legacy of the Code Talkers stands as more than a military achievement. It is a testament to human ingenuity, to the idea that strength is not only built in machines or weapons, but in the resilience of culture, in the endurance of memory, and in the power of language to protect, to unite, and to survive. In the end, the Navajo Code was never truly a secret. It was a voice, ancient, living, unbroken, speaking across history to remind us that even in war, what endures is not destruction, but the sound of humanity refusing to disappear. The Unbreakable Code was never written in numbers. It was written in people,